What's up, wrestling fans, trading card collectors? Welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Cards. Today we've got Drake Mcgruder on the show. If you're on Instagram or if you're on Twitter, chances are you've seen Drake floating around. Most people have probably seen him pop up in their social feeds as Drake_PC. And he's probably posting some awesome Peyton Manning or some shiny wrestling. I've been talking to Drake about wrestling cards and just the hobby in general pretty much since I started putting out content. So I'm super pumped to have him on the show today. Drake is one of the rare breeds in the hobby that can accurately and strategically navigate the worlds of wrestling cards as well as sports cards and see the similarities between both, how one applies to the other, vice versa. All while obtaining some of the most rare and awesome pieces to add to his personal collection that we've seen in both the sports card world as well as wrestling cards. In today's video, we cover a lot of topics. We talk about Drake growing up in the Memphis area, and you guys know I love my Memphis wrestling.
Be back in just a moment.
We talk about the differences that Drake sees between traditional sports cards and wrestling cards. You guys know I'm always liking to get different people's opinions on that. We also talk about some of the different ways that Drake approaches the hobby, using some of his Peyton Manning PC pieces. And we also talk about him being the lucky owner and, well, I guess, the record-breaking guy that wants to open his wallet to purchase the highest publicly sold Raw wrestling card in history. So let's get into the conversation with Drake Mcgruder, Drake's PC. What's up, everybody? Drake's PC. Drake, welcome to the show. Finally.
Hey, Zhan. Thanks. Glad to be on. Thank you for asking me. I love the show. So
thank you.
Let's talk some wrestling.
Speaking of that, at the time of recording, I didn't even realize that you were going to be on Brett's show once again to talk more wrestling. So, like, you are the wrestling guy now. I like it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've got just kind of one lined up right after the next. I mean, there's a lot of talk about wrestling cards. That's not a bad thing.
No, it's, rewind a year ago to this day. And, I'm still trying to push wrestling cards, but I was trying to push it then. And now we've got more people in the community. We've got more people that are in sports cards, maybe starting to turn their heads a little bit to us, but we'll jump into all of that. Just give everybody that's unfamiliar with you a brief introduction of yourself.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's Drake's PC on Instagram. Name is Drake Mcgruder. I actually live in Fort Smith, Arkansas, is where I'm at. I grew up in the Memphis area, so was very accustomed to wrestling and all that kind of stuff that we'll get into, and went to school at the University of Arkansas. Big Razorback fan and all that. So yeah, that's a little bit about me, kind of where I'm at. I started collecting cards as a kid, and then like most people, you get to college and marriage and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then I stepped away for a brief period of time. I was still dabbling in it here and there, but I wasn't hardcore into it. And then, back in, I guess, late 2019, I kind of got back into it and been full steam ahead since then. So
you grew up in the Memphis area. We got to talk about it. And that's just your introduction to wrestling, which, God, it has to be Memphis. And that's one thing that I like about the All-Star set that a lot of people don't talk about. Yeah, we've got Hogan and Flair and Andre, but we've also got Austin Idol, of course, Jerry the King Lawler, Jimmy Valiant. I mean, there's so many names in there that I associate with Memphis that when you look at other wrestling card sets, there's not a lot of Memphis represented in those. So let's just talk a little Memphis wrestling and your experience growing up in that area.
Oh, man. Like, where do we start, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll say my first exposure to wrestling. So my dad grew up in the Memphis area, but on the Arkansas side, he was in kind of that West Memphis area. And so his dad, they used to would take him down every Monday night down to what they called the Ellis Auditorium for wrestling matches, and they would see all of those guys. I mean, I'm struggling with names right now. I'm thinking in my head.
Bill Dundee, that's probably another one.
Yeah, but I mean, like even guys older than that,
Jackie Fargo.
Yeah. Yes,
yep.
Exactly. Like, Jackie Fargo and Yamamoto,
yep.
And, kind of those guys and stuff. So his dad kind of took him to do that. And that was the way that they bonded. And so, when 4 or 5 years old, late 80s or whatever, that was kind of the way that my dad and I would bond. Some dads like to take their kids fishing or hunting or something like that. My dad took me to wrestling.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And so we would be at the Mid-South Coliseum, really about every Monday night. Sometimes on Saturday mornings they had like Channel 5 studio wrestling. So we'd go down to Channel 5 studios with, Dave Brown and Lance Russell and, Jerry Lawler. And I mean, just you name it, the folks were there. And, I just have so many fond memories of that. And there were just so many experiences, not only of the matches there and just seeing, the folks and stuff like that. And so many folks, never went on to make it big, but so many did.
Yeah.
But it was just it was a fun time of wrestling, and it was just lots of great experiences. And, just the Monday nights. And then, lots of times they would have wrestling in like used car dealerships and flea markets, so like when The Rock talks about how he used to wrestle in flea markets in Memphis and all that, like I was there, like I know
so
that.
Cool. Yeah.
Right. But then there was this guy coming out, Flex Kavana, and I'm like, who knows who this guy is? Like I had no clue. Right. But I'm sitting there on the metal bleachers in the, they're in the flea market and, watching the guy that would later become the, probably the biggest star in pro wrestling history. So,
which that's a cool connection to cards later on, I'm sure we'll talk about. But I think Memphis, for anybody who is unfamiliar, you could go back on YouTube. There's so much TV and some live events. And there's just something about Memphis, like it's serious, but it's quirky and fun. Like it's just kind of what I think pro wrestling is. And you said a lot of those guys wouldn't go on to be stars, but in that area, they truly were stars because for the time they were on TV. They were, local celebrities. And that's just something I kind of miss about wrestling today. Before we move on from the Memphis talk, any other stories you can think of or experiences you had that the viewers would enjoy?
Oh man. I think about, you talk about the quirky matches. There was always like a concession stand battle royal, or, what you could win a new Cadillac, or, the loser leaves town match or something like that. But like there's a few stories that kind of come to mind. And there was one, and I don't remember who the match was because I was really young, but these guys were just beating the heck out of each other or whatever. And so one of the guys gets injured and has to get taken away on a stretcher, and he leaves in an ambulance and all that kind of stuff. Well, so the show continues on and all that. And then when the show gets over, my dad and I were stopping at McDonald's on the way home. We walk in and all those guys were sitting there just eating a Big Mac together. And I'm like, I thought these guys hated each other. Like, what is going on here? But even with that, I still didn't let like the kayfabe aspect go.
Right.
So that's just one kind of funny story I can think of. And really beyond that, it's just remembering, like, I think it was 92 when the Undertaker and Paul Bearer came down to the Mid-South Coliseum. And I think that was the great thing is Jerry Lawler and that group, they had the good relationship with Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation, that they would let them use some of their wrestlers on the shows there. And, eventually it became kind of the breeding ground for the World Wrestling Federation at the time. Right.
Yeah.
And so, you would have guys that was their developmental territory, but then they'd also bring guys down like, Triple H and Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit to wrestle matches in front of, 1,000 people.
Right.
And then, the next week they're in WrestleMania wrestling in front of tens of thousands of people. So it was awesome to get kind of that unique experience, really, from that aspect, to be able to get kind of that up close and personal deal with a lot of those, not only ones who were current superstars, but ones that would later go on to be superstars.
Yeah. Jerry Lawler, I don't think he gets enough credit. There's a whole generation that has no idea he was even a wrestler or a promoter or like any of that stuff. So I would encourage everybody, if you are unfamiliar with anything Memphis, whether it's actual Memphis from like, the 80s and backwards, or whether it's into the 90s when it kind of went to the USWA, that kind of stuff. Just go back and try to look at some of that old footage. And the other thing is, like, I don't think Memphis wrestling would exactly work on TV now because of how unpolitically correct it is. But at the same time, like, as I'm watching it, like, it may be offensive to some people, but as a whole, taking it out of context of that and putting it in kayfabe world, like, it's just so entertaining. So definitely one of my favorite promotions. I love World Class. I love Memphis, but I'm also like a wrestling historian. So it's fun to go back and look at that stuff. If you're tired of the current product, whether it's AEW or WWE, go back and watch some Memphis. That's all I got to say. So let's move on to wrestling cards. When did you start actually collecting wrestling cards? Was it in the late 80s with Topps, or was it, more recently?
Yeah, so it was definitely more recently. So, when I was growing up, you'd go to the shows and they would have the photos you could sign, or the photos that the wrestlers would sign, and they'd have boots or shirts or things like that. It was kind of funny because the wrestlers would, set up their own tables and sell their own merchandise, right? And then they would go to the back and wrestle their match, right? That was just how they made their money. And it seemed kind of normal. But, growing up, I collected sports cards, but the hobby shops that were in the Memphis area that I went to, none of them had wrestling cards, and it wasn't in the late 80s and 90s, right? There wasn't like an eBay or a Blowout or something like that where you could go and say, oh, there's wrestling, whatever. There wasn't Facebook and Twitter and all that. So wrestling cards were foreign to me. And then, like I said, I got out, but I stopped really hardcore collecting back like 2001, 2002. And then you're going to college, and, then Facebook was created in 04 and all that kind of stuff. And you're worried about, getting married and starting a career and all that kind of stuff. You're not really looking on eBay to see like, oh, they're wrestling cards. It just wasn't. So even though I continued to watch the product, since I wasn't collecting other sports, it never really dawned on me like, oh, I should collect wrestling cards.
Right.
So, but then I would say probably 5 years ago, I started getting back into like the memorabilia side of things, because I'd always kind of kept up with the memorabilia, and mostly it's like signed photos and, smaller stuff that you can keep. But then I started to see like, oh, there's like signed wrestling boots, and there's, signed ring worn trunks, or, name your favorite thing that wrestlers can sign.
Sure.
So I started getting that. But then, as with any kind of memorabilia, it starts to take up a lot of room.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what pushed me back into card collecting, because I was doing the memorabilia of wrestling and sports type stuff as well too. I mean, I think you can see behind me, I've got all kinds of Razorback balls and helmets and New Orleans Saints. And
Colts. It looks nice and neatly displayed, so I don't think you're going too overboard.
Exactly. Well, what you don't see is what's in the cabinet, and the cabinet's shut. It's like that. So anyway, so that's kind of what pushed me back into cards. And then I kind of learned about podcasts, and, I found your podcast, and I heard like David Peck, I think on the Lucas Tigers and Bronze Punk, and they were talking wrestling cards. I'm like, well, I think I should check into that. So you go to eBay, and next thing you know, there's wrestling cards, and I'm like, man, these are kind of cool. And so I would say it was probably like mid 2020. So I've probably been back into it the last like year and a half.
Yeah. And, getting back into it, it's not, I think that's putting it lightly. I'd say you were like dove in head first, and you're like one of the whales now, just swooping up all you and Brett. You guys are taking over the world of shiny wrestling cards, which I think is great. So let's talk into, and we could take this so many different directions. I think you're a great person to ask the honest question, because I know you'll give us the honest feedback. Differences and similarities between wrestling cards and sports cards. I mean, whether it's value, popularity, the collectors and fan bases of it. There's a lot we can go with this. So I don't know where you want to start, but I'm just trying to look for more people who aren't, inside that wrestling bubble, that are only collecting wrestling cards or wrestling memorabilia, people that have experience with sports cards or other types of memorabilia. So the floor is yours to start.
All right. Yeah. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is, you think other sports cards, we'll just take basketball, for example, right? If you want to collect a certain player, Panini has so many sets and parallels and this, that, and the other, that it's almost overwhelming to try to figure out, okay, yeah, I'd love to collect every card I can of this player, but like, what are the real like meaningful cards?
I gotcha.
And so it's kind of tough in that aspect. Whereas with wrestling cards, you're at this point, and I'm sure we'll talk about where we're going later, but at this point you think like, okay, I want to collect, John Cena cards, right? Well, he's got, Topps Chrome and some parallels, and he's got, Topps Finest, and, there's some more, like the fully loaded and the undisputed, and, all just that kind of stuff. But
sure,
it really narrows it down when you get to wrestling cards. And especially for someone like me, where I'm like, okay, there's only a few set cards that I want to go after for my collection. Mm-hmm. That certainly helps, when there's not all these like, green scope, power, disco mojo prism type thing, and so I think that's kind of one difference, that I'll say. The second thing I think that comes to mind is with, and again, we'll just go back to basketball cards. If I go to basketball cards and I pay, we'll just say $2,000 for a hobby box, there's a chance in that hobby box that I could pull a card that, say it grades high or whatever. It could be a 5-figure card plus, right? In wrestling cards, you don't see that.
That,
right?
yeah.
So, if you go and buy a $2,000 box of wrestling cards, which there's really not, right? I mean, that'd be like a couple cases, right?
Well, I
Then,
mean, I think the closest really we would be looking at that would be the Transcendent stuff. That's
right.
about it.
Yeah. And that was like what, that was 13,000 a
Yeah.
case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, which we'll talk about that next. But, let's just say, you buy a $200 box of Topps Chrome or whatever. Well, you may open that up and, you're not likely going to find a card that's over $200 that comes out of that box, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so people will spend a lot of money ripping wax and all that kind of stuff. And that's a whole lot of fun. But if you're doing that thinking like you're going to hit the mother load, the mother load just really isn't there
Right.
yet. I'm not saying it won't be there, but it's just, and so I think that's kind of the third thing that comes to mind is I find in wrestling that people are just rip the heck out of wax,
Yeah.
which I mean, it makes sense because it's cheaper, it's cheaper to rip $100-$200 box versus a $2,000 box.
Right.
That's a lot of boxes you can rip. So it's a lot of fun to rip and things like that. But I think there's a whole lot more collectors in the wrestling community. And then there's a lot more collectors/investors right now in the sports card community. And so I think that's just a few of the differences that come to mind.
Well, I'm glad you lined those out because now we can kind of piggyback off that and break into each one of those. As far as like the Panini and the parallels, it depends on what you're doing. If you are the investor collector type, I 100% agree with you. From a super collector standpoint, though, I think it's a blast. Like, I wish Karrion Kross, Killer Kross now, if he was still in the WWE product when Panini takes over, I would be like having a heyday because I'd be like, all right, I get like 50 million different parallels of the same guy. And when you put them in like together in a binder or spread out slabs, like it just looks really cool. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you from that standpoint. The next thing is, let's just talk about the wax. And at the time of recording, we're seeing a lot of people come out with AEW, and we've seen the odds of those boxes, what the autos and parallels are per case, per pack, and it's not good. Yet people are still ripping. And I'm having a hard time telling if these people ripping the boxes are truly fans or if they are doing what you said, and that is looking for those autos because they're so rare and then the flip. But then kind of tying that back into something else you said, why do you think that we're at this point where you could pull, I don't know, let's just say, go back to basketball. Let's say there's a card that's equivalent to a $5,000 pull raw that you could just, pack pull, put it on eBay, sell for around 5,000. For the most part, why do you think that doesn't exist in wrestling? Do you think it is not enough of a fan base? Do you think it's because most people collect? Or do you think it's, just, I don't know. Like, that's one thing that's kind of dumbfounded me is if you put, a Hulk Hogan shiny parallel that's close to like a Kobe parallel, Kobe might be 15 to 20 times higher for price, even though when you compare the two sports, they're about the same, if not Hogan, maybe even higher. So what do you think the disparaging is between the price and markets on that?
Yeah, since I think that other sports, have a longer, more mature market, people feel more confident seeking a bunch of money into that. So you have more people who are in money into it. I mean, if you think about it, and we'll just use, say, like David Peck as an example. Mm-hmm. 10 years ago, nobody really cared about the wrestling all-stars, sure, and weren't willing to seek a bunch of money and all that kind of stuff and everything. And so I think once people look at something and they see like all-time sales and all that kind of stuff, it gives them confidence, right, that they're buying the right thing. And so you're not always seeing that with wrestling cards. A wrestling card, an all-time sale might be $400, right?
Yeah.
And so, people are looking, just people that are kind of like seeking alpha, right? They're looking for those tens of thousands of dollars in a market that is more mature, is really the first thing that I think. And then the second thing is there's just really not that huge collector base, or that there's really not that base yet where people are wanting to come in and we're kind of in the situation where I was in, right? I'm a wrestling fan, but I really wasn't aware of wrestling cards and that they had value and stuff like that. And so I think the more awareness that, like, your channel and the rest of the channels and stuff like that can bring to the wrestling card community to get people to think like, oh, okay, it goes beyond just signed pictures and memorabilia and things like that. There's actually cards out there
that are easier to store, and you're a prime example of that.
Exactly. And really, whatever your flavor is, if you're if you're a shiny guy, there's shiny parallels out there. If you want something that was ring worn, that's out there. If you're wanting a signature, that's out there. And so I think it's just getting more awareness around that, and then getting people really to buy in and believe in something.
Great points. And again, piggybacking off of your points, I knew this would be some good dialogue with just kind of opening the floodgates on the differences. One thing that I think is interesting, and I want to take a parallel to, is F1. It's exploded. There's not a lot of product out there. And it's actually kind of going against what you said, because there's no proven record for it, really. We had F1 cards in the 90s, but they weren't really popular, just like every other ancillary thing that's not the big three or big four in the sports. People are willing to throw down some serious money. And it's one of those things where I'll even throw Pokemon in there. You've got the mainstream hobby talking heads, and throw a dart. You could pick any of them. Maybe they like wrestling. Maybe they might make a wrestling reference as a joke or something, but they are not looking at wrestling cards the same way that they are these ancillary cards that don't have a huge track record. And actually, in some cases, wrestling has a longer track record, but they're still not even recognizing them as a, viable part of the hobby ecosystem, so to speak. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are people they maybe know of wrestling cards, but they're still not taking them serious when they are taking these other ancillary areas more seriously? It's very, I don't know if dumbfounded is the word, but it's really interesting to me. I don't understand it.
Yeah. I think my best answer to that would be, and those other things, right? I guess they're considered like real sports, and, there's accomplishments there where, there's guys that are positioning in F1, and, there's races that they win and that sort of thing. And when you look at overall, I mean, in the last, we'll just say, 5 years, what big star has come out of the WWE? Maybe probably Roman Reigns.
Roman Reigns,
the biggest
maybe
on the male side.
Yeah, as far as newer, I mean,
right.
There's
Charlotte,
been a lot of there's been a lot of females, which if you want to pinpoint just kind of wrestling card collecting, that's where a lot of the money is those newer females. So that makes sense.
Yep, exactly. And so I think people, when they're wanting to put their money into something, they're wanting something that's kind of that. There's always that talk about like modern versus retired, players and all that kind of stuff. And so you see people sinking all this money into, we'll just say football, like a Patrick Mahomes or whatever. And then you're looking at a guy like a Peyton Manning, right? Who's number 2, number 3, whatever you want to look at, QB all time. And he's kind of like pushed by the wayside.
Right.
And so now there's these great cards of guys like, the all-time greats like The Rock and Hulk Hogan and John Cena, but they're really they're retired. They're not really active as much anymore, things like that. So people aren't really wanting to get in there and sink that much money into it. But then on the flip side, you've got that prospecting game, but then people are also seeing, they're making all these cuts all the time. Right. Yeah. And so you may sink a bunch of money into like a Karrion Kross, for example, or something like that. And then they're let go. That doesn't mean they're done with wrestling or anything like that, but they're in that product.
Right.
Or, they may be like a Daniel Bryan who goes to AEW and now he's Bryan Danielson. So, somebody going to want a card with Daniel Bryan on it, right? From an investment standpoint. And so I think that's kind of the tricky spot that we're in, is we've got all these phenomenal cards coming out right now, but all those people who, from a nostalgia standpoint, people know, and the names Undertaker and, Hulk Hogan and The Rock and, those guys are not really as active anymore.
Right.
And then the ones that are active are not really a household name, because I remember when I was in high school, you might as well shut down school that Monday night when Hulk Hogan and Goldberg were going to wrestle in Nitro.
That was nuts. I still remember watching that.
Oh, it's like wildfire. If I walked into the local high school here and I said, hey, do you know who Matt Riddle is? No disrespect to Matt Riddle, but people would be like, who?
Yeah.
And he's a deadgum tag team champion.
Right.
Right. And so I I think that's what's changed. And I think that's why you're not seeing as much money coming into this space as you are on something like an F1, for example.
Hey, real quick, I hope you guys are enjoying this interview with Drake, and I hope you're enjoying this video. Just want to take a second to remind you of a few ways you can help support all of my content if you're enjoying this video. Easiest thing you can do, and it's free, hit subscribe, give me a like, and share the show with a friend. Talk about the channel, copy, paste it, send it to a link, put it on social media. Just get the word out there about wrestling with cards and the great community we have around the channel. Don't forget to check out the links below in the show notes to everything else I'm involved with. 2 different podcasts, Wrestling with Cards and Worlds Collide. If you would like to contribute to my content monetarily, links below in the show notes to my Patreon. You can contribute as little as $1 a month. That goes a long way going back into the channel for equipment and everything that goes into putting out content. There's also links to my eBay store if you want to pick up some cheap stuff, some inexpensive slabs, some wrestling cards. Got tons of stuff there. Social links are down there too, at Zhan Morning on most social platforms. Give me a follow. Feel free to share any of my content, tag me in it. Happy to retweet and give you a shout out. And of course, links below if you want to buy me a coffee. I gotta stay caffeinated. Let's get back to the conversation with Drake. I 100% agree. That is a valid point from a kind of outsider's perspective. We're still in that spot, like you said, where there are wrestling fans out there just not really buying cards. And I don't know, there could be a lot of different reasons for that. They could not know they exist. It could be where, you know, they have an attachment to figures or memorabilia over the cards. Maybe that changes. I don't know. Just an interesting dynamic when you look at like sports fans are like fiending for sports cards, not so much in wrestling. But I just don't understand that, you know, nostalgia, and you can speak for this as well, based on a lot of the cards you buy. Nostalgia drives this stuff, especially wrestling. And I see it in Marvel too. You know, people latch onto a character or remember a certain character from a comic they liked or a show or a movie, and all of a sudden those cards explode. What I still don't understand though is, like, again, talking heads, they will talk about wrestling. They know Hogan, they know The Rock, Cena, Undertaker. They may not be active, but they're also at the same time pumping, not dumping, but pumping, like, you know, we'll say Peyton Manning. We'll say, you know, super vintage stuff like Jim Brown cards, maybe. You know, those guys aren't active, but there's a respect and everybody knows them. And I just don't understand why that section hasn't translated to wrestling, because, again, I think The Rock, Hogan, Austin, Flair, I think those guys are even bigger than a lot of these sports, like, athletes that get put on these pedestals. So any opinions on that?
Yeah, you know, I think the one thing that comes to mind is just, for in certain time periods, it's like, if you like wrestling, it's kind of like not cool, you know. And so, you know, think back to the late 90s, it was like everybody liked wrestling, and like if you didn't like wrestling, you know, it's like, ugh, you know. And now sometimes, like, if you know, if I talk to somebody, like, I'm not ashamed to say I still watch wrestling, and I'm, you know, and I'm almost 40 years old, but you kind of get that look like, you still watch wrestling? Like, wasn't that, you know, when you were a kid? Like, you know, that's fake, right? You know, you get all those questions. And so I think it's different in that aspect where, like, you know, if you go to your buddy and you're like, hey, did you check out the F1 race or something this weekend? Like, that's more like
acceptable,
cool, I guess, acceptable and something like that. And so I think that's why people, like, in my mind, and I don't know this to be true, but I think there's a lot of like closet wrestling fans and closet collectors and people who probably scooping up some, you know, some big cards and things like that, because, you know, again, if you look for those big cards, like, where are they at? You know, you think about the Hulk Hogan 1982 Wrestling All-Stars. There hasn't been a PSA 9 hit auction anywhere in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like there's just one of them. There's multiple of those and things like that. So I think there's just other cards that are out there that are big cards, you know, that only come up for sale once a year. And I think people are just holding them, which I also think creates problems in the markets, because if people aren't selling, right, people aren't finding out, like, hey, you know, there's these big cards out there that are being bought and sold because everybody's just holding and not really selling as much. And I think it takes selling to create a market.
100%. I've been saying that, and which is good on both aspects. Like, it's good that we have such a big collector base, because that means people care about the card, whether it's $1 card, whether it's a, you know, several thousands, it doesn't matter. The fact that people appreciate their cards so much that they don't want to sell even something that's not even that important is fantastic. But like you said, on the flip side, if there's nothing available, the market becomes stagnant, and we're never going to grow the community, the ecosystem that's within just our little niche of a niche, you know. So it's just an interesting dynamic. Two other things we'll talk about that you mentioned. Let's talk about Transcendent. Let's talk about that Vince McMahon 1-of-1 auto that you are officially the owner of. And when I saw it sell, I, like, no disrespect, I didn't think it was going to be anybody that I know. And then all of a sudden I see you post, I'm like, this guy, he's officially the modern king. So how does it feel to be the holder of the highest selling modern Raw wrestling card publicly sold in history? Congratulations.
Well, first of all, my wallet feels a lot lighter. So
is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, I mean, I think it feels like really good. And that was one of those cards that I saw. And again, when I wouldn't really call myself like a player collector or a certain super collector. I collect for nostalgia. And like I said, going back to when I was, you know, probably barely out of diapers, right? You know, the World Wrestling Federation was what I watched. It was either at Memphis at the Mid-South Coliseum, or it was wrestling on Monday, Saturday, Sunday, whenever it was on, I was watching that. And Vince McMahon, you know, as a promoter and then as a commentator and then as a performer. And, you know, I mean, he's been a big part of my life for 35 years, just about, right?
Same. Mm-hmm.
And so when you see a card like that come across and, you know, it's from Topps Transcendent, which is the highest end wrestling product that Topps has. And, you know, unless something happens in the future and Topps gets the license back and Vince is still around, right? I mean, he's not getting any younger, bless him.
Correct.
But, you know, at the end of the day, this could be his only Superfractor, which is the kind of the gold standard when it comes to Topps products, right?
Right.
And his only autographed 1-of-1 card. And it was just one of those things where I'm like, you know, for me as a wrestling fan, and, you know, as you've said before on the channel and others have said, I mean, he's the Walt Disney of wrestling.
Yeah. And then right now, go try to find Walt Disney autos, like, you know.
Yep, exactly. Well, I checked just before this podcast. There was only one on eBay and the seller wanted 65 grand for it.
There you go.
Know? And it was one that was said, you know, signed to somebody. It wasn't like an actual autograph card or anything like that. And so I think, you know, Vince McMahon is very polarizing.
Absolutely. Especially now.
Oh yeah. Love him, hate him. People think he's, you know, he's dragging the product down and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, when you think of wrestling, right, the first name you think of is Vince McMahon. And, you know, just like we spoke previously, if I walked much anywhere and I said, hey, do you know who Vince McMahon is? Everybody knows who Vince McMahon is, regardless if you're a wrestling fan or not. So for me, it was just a card that I looked at and I just said, hey, there's got to be some way that I can get this card. And then I also was thinking, okay, from a pricing standpoint, a case of Transcendent is $13,000, right?
Yep.
There's 47, I guess, wrestlers that, or should we call them sports entertainers?
Either way.
That signed cards and have different parallels and things like that. So to ensure myself, you know, and this isn't realistic, but to ensure myself I got a Vince McMahon 1-of-1 Superfractor, I would have had to do 13,000 times 47, which is, you know, north of $600,000.
Right.
To hopefully get that card.
That's ridiculous to think about that.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it and you think, okay, to actually pull this 1-of-1, and what are the, you know, it's a 1 in 47 chance of pulling that one. You know, to get that for a price under what the cost of a case is, I mean, that seems like a deal to me. You know, even though, again, heck of a lot of money, I don't want to put that down or things like that. You know, I'm not trying to sit here and say like, oh, it's nothing. It's cheap for me. It's not cheap for me. There were some things I had to do to make it happen. Right.
I was getting ready to say, I bet you did you move some of your other PC stuff to get there?
Yep, I did. So, but it was just one of those cards that I just looked at and I'm like, you know, for me and as big a part of my life, you know, that he was, and, you know, things like that. Now my wife thinks differently. She's like, that's so dumb, but whatever. It's meaningful to me.
Right. That's interesting. You bring up the polarization of Vince. I think people that are around our age, if you were a fan in the 80s and 90s, we'll just leave it at that. Like, you're probably a fan of Vince McMahon. And even if you don't like him, I think people in those two eras understand the importance. You know, he's a huge successful entrepreneur. He is a promoter. He's a entertainer, wrestler, booker, if you want to go old school term with that. Like he's everything. And it may be like even more important than Walt Disney when you stop and think about it. Walt Disney changed Disney, which has all these intellectual properties now. Vince McMahon changed the world of professional wrestling, not just a company. So when you look at it like that, it's a no-brainer. Let me bring up something else that ties in what we were talking about before. You're willing to spend, you're a wrestling fan, you're willing to spend this money, you've done the math, which, when you just laid that out for me, I was like, what a genius. This makes total sense when you approach it that way. It's a deal. Like, so people that were buying Transcendent, trying to get something like that, again, as you said earlier, even with the highest quality tops product in wrestling, your return on a Superfractor still, for what you paid, still wouldn't be hitting what you paid for the case. Like it's crazy. So you're willing to spend that money, but that's another thing I think that's the problem with the wrestling card ecosystem. I think there's a lot of people that aren't willing to shell out that kind of money when they see something like that. And there could be a lot of different reasons why, but do you think like you just went above and beyond, or do you see that also as a potential issue that's different between wrestling and sports? Because I mean, you've seen it, I've seen it. These guys that will latch onto a prospect and they will literally put six figures into this prospect's cards and then they don't pan out. But with wrestling, it's like we have problems having someone pay $10 for a card sometimes. So do you see the parallels with that, or am I just kind of going nuts here?
Oh no, I mean, you're spot on. I think that's the other thing I see, especially, I mean, I'm in some Facebook groups and things like that, and I see that, and people, it just blows their mind with, when they see a fractor out of 50 sell for like $300, right? And then I look at that and I'm like, well, if I saw a gold refractor of a player, I like if there was a Peyton Manning gold refractor for $300, I'm going to buy it right now. Right. And so it's interesting to me, I guess, the perspectives of, what is reasonable for certain cards. Right. And so, and I think, and maybe that's a distorted view from a sports/wrestling card collector, because again, like we'll just look at Peyton Manning and we'll look at John Cena, for example. Sure. Right. So, a John Cena gold refractor is out of 50, Topps Chrome gold refractor is out of 50. And it's, probably, we'll just say in a PSA 10, it's $1,500.
Sure. Right. That sounds about right.
Yeah. You take a Peyton Manning PSA 10 gold refractor out of 50, which, by the way, John Cena, right now only has 3 Topps Chrome gold refractors. Yeah. Peyton Manning has a ton of Topps Chrome gold refractors. So it's really not an apples to apples comparison, but a PSA 10 of him is, what, $3,000,
which makes no sense, because you would think that less Cena, there'd be a higher demand because there's less of them.
Exactly. And so that's why, if you ask a question like why are you willing to spend money on wrestling cards like that? And that's how I look at it, be it from being the sports collector going to wrestling collectors. I look at it and I'm like, like this is that person's, like, they only have 3 gold refractors. Like The Rock, he's got, 2014, 2015, 2020. That's his only base gold refractors that he's going to have probably ever in Topps. Right. So that's 150 cards total. And so, to have each one of those.
When you really stop and think about the numbers and then you see the prices, it just doesn't make sense.
No, I'll show you. I haven't shared this one yet with anybody. But see this guy?
Nice. I love that card. Yeah.
So the Hulk Hogan gold refractor, so that's a PSA 9. There's no PSA 10s currently. Not to say there won't ever be, but 2015 is the only year that Hulk Hogan had a gold refractor. Nice. In Topps Chrome. And so, when you look at the cost of that, which there's only 50, and then you go back to the 1982 Wrestling All-Stars, which, is the iconic card and is going to be, and, may or may not be his rookie card, whatever. Yeah. There's a heck of a lot more than 50 of those. Yes. And to get a PSA 9 gold refractor of Hulk Hogan, yeah, maybe it's like past his prime and it doesn't have that iconic look to it and stuff like that, for a heck of a lot less than a PSA 9, 1982 All-Stars would cost. Right. It just seems like a no-brainer for me, and especially for somebody who likes the shiny stuff and stuff that's numbered and things of that nature.
Yeah, you and Brett, you guys have really put perspective on the shiny legends that are out there in products, whether it's something that came out this year or something that came out in like 2010. There's so much out there that people can go after. You're talking about Peyton Manning, and that's one thing I wanted to transition into is, we see all of your Peyton Manning cards that you're posting on Instagram, your stories behind it, why the cards are important. Talk a little bit about that, and then what do you think that wrestling card collectors could take from that and apply it to whatever they're doing? Because I think, like I said, I can speak from the Karrion Kross stuff that once I started diving in, and I've been buying even more after he's been cut because I like the cards, I like the designs, and I've just become attached to him. And I see your Peyton Manning stuff, and that's kind of how I feel about my Karrion Kross stuff, Killer Kross, whatever. But I think there's maybe some frustrated wrestling fans that I'm not gonna say they don't know how to collect, but there's like too many things going on. So they're trying, I'm trying to always tell people, pick a lane. You've picked a lane. You've got an attachment to it. I love the way you do it. So what do you think? Talk about that. And then what do you think wrestling cards and the collectors of them can apply that to their collections?
Yep. So I think the first thing is if you're going to play or collect somebody, you've got to have some kind of attachment, right? So growing up in the Memphis area and, the Vols in the late 90s and all that kind of stuff. So Peyton Manning, I was a big fan of Tennessee, and, that's how I grew to love him. And so late 90s, that's who I collected mostly, was his rookie cards. And I didn't understand at the time, at the kid, like, wow, these inserts and parallels are really cool, and you should probably be going after those. Instead, I just remember I would pull out, open up packs of cards when they were like $1.50 a pack, right?
Sure.
And put away all of the Peyton Manning rookie cards. And so I had this big stack of Peyton Manning rookie cards of all different levels and things like that. And so, getting back into it, it was easy for me to look at it and say, like, okay, well, what rookie cards do I not have? And then I started expanding beyond the rookie cards, because then I think the biggest or parallel, and I'll try to kind of jump around a little bit, but You start going in there and you're like, well, his Bowman Chrome PSA 10 is really cool, but when I look at the populations, there's like thousands of other people that have a Bowman Chrome Peyton Manning PSA 10 rookie card, and then you go and look at, okay, well, for that same price, I could get a game worn jersey auto numbered out of 10.
Right.
That, I've got it, and then only 9 other people have that. And so I think that's where that like rarity and scarcity factor kind of comes in.
Yep.
So I think that's the first thing I'll say is when you look at, a wrestler or player, whatever you collect, you may start with their rookie cards or base cards or something like that, but then get something that's like meaningful to you, that's like rare and scarce. So that way, if you ever have to sell it or something like that, somebody's thinking that same way. They're not wanting something that they can just, jump on eBay and there's 100 copies of that card. I think the second thing is find other players of like cards that they have that maybe you're doing well, and you may have that card and it hasn't performed very well yet, right? And so I think, like for example, Peyton Manning and Tom Brady are always linked. And one time Peyton Manning's cards were a lot more expensive than Tom Brady. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, with Peyton retiring and with Brady continuing his dominance, right, his stuff has continued to appreciate. But when you look at it and you say like, okay, 2002 Topps Chrome Black Refractor, okay, it's numbered out of 599. The Brady is like a pop 13, and I think the last sell of that was like $56,000. Okay,
jeez.
That was his considered his Topps Chrome rookie because he didn't have one his rookie year. You go in and look, okay, well, what's Peyton Manning's first Topps Chrome Black Refractor? Well, it's also 2002. Well, the PSA 10 and that's a pop 4. Well, if you look on Card Ladder, the predictive value of that card is like $2,000. So It's like you're telling me that there's that much of a premium to that. So that makes me ask myself, okay, is Brady overvalued or is Manning undervalued? And so I say all that to say, not say that's not a great card or anything like that. But I think when you look at someone you collect, right, you look at similar players that are relative to that person and say, okay, well, what's that card selling for? And maybe is there an opportunity for me to buy this card, at a reasonable price where there's some appreciation potential right there in place. And so that's kind of the way that I approach because, Peyton Manning's got a ton of cards.
Yeah.
There's saved searches I have for like Peyton Manning refractor, Peyton Manning like auto. And when I open up the email in the morning, it's like, 588 new listings.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot to go through too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's the biggest thing is just, if you see a card of someone else that you like, if you don't collect that, male or female wrestler or whatever, go see if the person that you collect has that same kind of card.
Good observation.
Yep. And then try to go after that. And then, look at it from a price. If you're concerned about price and, from an investment potential and things like that, I think that's the way you can kind of look at it and see like, okay, is this a good price? Otherwise, if you're just saying, hey, so I have Morgan, but I see that Becky Lynch has this, gold out of 10, ring worn patch auto kind of thing. Well, maybe I need to go find and see if Liv Morgan has that as well too. And so that's kind of the way that I approach stuff is I'll see cool cards of other players. And then I'm like, oh, well, that was a year that Manning played. Maybe I should go see if he has that same card.
Makes sense. Great information. I'm hoping it's going to help everybody. One other thing I want to touch on your collection, just the way you approach. I have a similar kind of way of going about it. So correct me if I'm missing something, but it seems like you're going after the kind of rare, big names of wrestling. And then Peyton Manning stuff. Is there anything else I'm missing that you're just like super into, or because from what I see you posting, that's pretty much it?
Yeah. So when I got back into cards back in like 2019, I was wanting to get like legends of the game. I was all about the retired players, and I was like, okay, let's get a rookie card and an autograph of like all the top 50 players in the NBA. And I did that. And so then I'm like, okay, well, let's go to the NFL. And then all of a sudden I'm like, gosh, man, I'm spreading myself really thin.
Yep.
And so, they're great cards. They all appreciate it in value, but I didn't have a connection to like Bob McAdoo.
Sure. Yeah.
Phenomenal player. But when I looked at the card, it just didn't really do a whole lot for me. So then I went back and kind of dug out and I'm like, okay, Peyton Manning, that's who I want to focus on and go after. So I sold a lot of those cards to go after the Peyton Manning. And so, and then with wrestling, it's funny because I'm doing kind of the same path, right? I'm going and I'm like, let's go after Vince and Rock and Cena and Hogan and The Undertaker and Stone Cold and all that. But sometimes I ask myself, I'm like, am I spreading myself too thin?
Yes.
And am I casting that net too wide? And sometimes I say yes, but then other times I'm like, well, I don't really know, because again, you look at Stone Cold Steve Austin, he doesn't have a lot of autograph cards,
and his stuff hasn't popped either, like those other guys we've talked about. It's really strange.
Yep. You look at The Rock. I mean, he basically has one WWF license signed card. Vince doesn't have a lot. And so that's the part that's tough is all those guys bring a sense of nostalgia to me. Mm-hmm. But when you look at, okay, well, how many cards of theirs are out there that I could have, that are meaningful to me, that kind of fit into the way that I collect, which is typically the shiny,
right.
The autographs that are on card, that kind of stuff. There's just really not a lot out there. So I feel like I can still kind of stay casting that wide net a little bit, but, depending on what happens with, the future of wrestling cards with going from Topps to Panini and things like that, I may have to trim that back at some point, just really kind of depending on what happens. But yeah, in terms of what I collect, it's basically the wrestling legends, nostalgia, those kind of folks, and Manning.
That's kind of how I do it. I've got the killer carrying cross. It's frustrating jumping back and forth between the names. But anyway, I've got his super PC everything from base cards to one-on-ones. I'm trying to get everything. I'm having more fun doing that than I ever have. It's a little bit more affordable, so that's fun. On the flip side, I got two things I want to focus on. I've got my All-Stars cards, which eventually will get slabbed, and then trying to get those signed, trying to get those upgraded. I'm not a set collector. But as we said when we started this, with the connection to Memphis, the connection to world class, WWF, NWA, everybody that I love that's a legend in wrestling is in that set. So that set is important to me. Other than that, the thing I love about wrestling is I feel like I can be a part of it, have cool cards, like you said, have rare cards. I don't have to have it all. That's one thing I love, is going after, oh, this Becky card looks cool, I want to pick it up. I like this Sasha card, let's take that. Here's a Cena card that's a relic, gotta have that. You can pick and choose, and it's something, in my opinion, that's cool. Okay, if the floor goes out on these, I don't care because I like them. But at the same time, if I need to, you know, buy something, put it into your perspective, I need that Peyton Manning card, I can maybe sell that or that, because while it's cool, maybe it appreciated in value, I don't have an attachment to it like that. So the way you're approaching it, kind of the way I'm doing it, and I think that's like the best thing that people can do. You talked about Panini and Topps. What do you see the future of wrestling cards? We could take this whatever direction you want. I was very optimistic when Panini got the license. I was like, this is it. It's going to be huge. We got Upper Deck AEW. We got Panini Prism WWE coming out. 2022 is going to be huge. All of a sudden that flipped. And now, you know, we're going to have Topps having everything, or Topps and Fanatics over here with everything. And then like Panini is going to have like soccer, NASCAR, and maybe WWE. So I'm almost like, oh, we're back where we started with Topps. I could be just completely wrong, and maybe all the Prism boys are going to still come out and try to flip all that retail stuff. But what is your opinion on kind of the licensing there? And then where do you see wrestling cards going in the overall picture?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has changed with the Fanatics news, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of took the wind out of the sails a little bit. But I still think with the timing of WrestleMania, you know, with the release of Prism and all that kind of stuff, I still, you know, it'll be more expensive. And so I think some of the, you know, longtime folks, you know, as I've seen, you know, I think they're going to have to step up to the, or somebody else will, quite frankly.
Yeah.
You know,
and I'm sorry to cut you off. I continually say that in the video. And I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to like give people an advance notice, and I'm not trying to run people out of the hobby. It's just the facts are the facts. You know, you said it. So.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it's the timing of the release is important with WrestleMania, but I also think, you know, it's going to correlate a lot to what the WrestleMania card looks like. You know, I mean, you know, if you go in and, you know, I mean, it's no disrespect to these guys, but like if your biggest match is, you know, Brock Lesnar versus Bobby Lashley, and, you know, Roman Reigns versus, I don't know, Jey Uso, let's just make it up, right? I mean, that doesn't generate a lot of excitement, right? But I mean, could you imagine, and this is kind of like fantasy booking type thing, but it's like, could you imagine, right, if, you know, they're in Dallas, Texas, and, you know, you've got like Roman Reigns versus The Rock, you know, and then, you know, Stone Cold Steve Austin is involved somehow. The Undertaker, not in a wrestling capacity, but he's involved somehow. And, you know, John Cena comes back. And then, oh, by the way, they've got these cards coming out, and there's gold prisms of The Rock. And, you know, and there's just a whole lot of excitement around that. I think that can only be good for the Panini product. You know, but I think it's gonna take something like that, you know, and I think that's what we're seeing, you know, with AEW, the product, in my opinion, I think is the hottest, best thing on wrestling TV right now.
Yeah.
But then the cards come out and they're kind of, you know, like you mentioned previously, the hits aren't really there. You know, they're not like the on-card autos. There's really not a whole lot of shiny stuff. They're just kind of like, ooh, you know, and so that's gonna hurt that product, I think. So it's really going to depend on what that marriage looks like between the release of the product, what the card looks like, what's going on in the wrestling industry at the time, to really see that kind of take off. And then I'm looking forward to see, you know, what comes next from a Panini standpoint with wrestling cards.
Yeah. Can you imagine all of the sports stuff we've seen Panini translated over to wrestling? Like, one thing that I think has been that there are a few out there, but wrestling is missing RPAs. Now, how you define what the rookie card is, and like we've already heard Upper Deck say they're not putting the rookie card logo on there because it's too hard to determine. And, you know, like in hindsight, maybe that is a thing that's kind of hard for people to get into wrestling cards, is that there's no rookie logos. But at the same time, like, I'd rather have some kind of shiny limited version of you know, the Hogan PSA 9 gold you just showed. Like, it is really hard for me to pick that over, or I mean, it would be hard for me to pick like his 85 tops over that, because I think that's awesome. Prime example is we both have it, so we're in the exclusive club, the Hogan PMG. That's my favorite Hogan card. I like it better than the 82 All-Stars. I like it better than your gold refract. Like, it's just, there's something that really connects with me about. So it's going to be interesting. I'm hoping that we expand the community. I'm hoping that people that are closet wrestling fans start getting into it. You know, wrestling fans that are buying everything else, hopefully they're coming into cards. I think 2022 from a wrestling card perspective is going to be one of the most exciting times that we've ever seen in the hobby, from sales and product and popularity. Could be wrong, but that's my prediction. So thanks for coming on today. Any parting words you have for the wrestling card community as we close the show?
Yeah, so I think the parting word would be just, that things are changing. And I think, the wrestling community just continue to evolve, and look for different parallels in other sports. Try not to be so closed-minded into wrestling cards that you don't look outside of what's going on. And I think that's why there's been such a big boom lately in wrestling cards, primarily with the shiny stuff like the gold refractors, is because sports collectors have seen what has taken place with, the other sports, and they come in and say, well, gosh, I can get, this legendary performer, a gold refractor out of 50, and right now it's cheap. So, I think things are changing, and I think it's important to look at ways you can kind of marry your investing and collecting. So, don't just say, if you just want to collect, that's perfectly fine. But there's certain things that you can collect that are also good investments. And I think when you marry those two things together, I think it's a win-win for you.
And not being able to let stuff go. You said it best. Like, you wanted that Vince card, so you had to let go of some other stuff. Or you wanted the Peyton card, so you had to let go of this stuff over here. Like, that's something I've been trying to just drill into people's head is, like, I'm not necessarily saying buy stuff to flip it, but buy stuff and, like, kind of put aside the stuff you really don't want to sell, put away a few pieces. But then if you got to sell that other stuff to get the card you want in your PC, your player collection, whatever, you gotta let it go. I know that's not popular within the wrestling card hobby, but you've said it. Like, if you didn't let go of some of your stuff, do you think you would have been able to get that Vince McMahon so easily?
Right. Nope.
Exactly. All right, Drake, thanks for your time today. Let everybody know where they can find you so they can see this ridiculous collection, including that Vince card.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So it's at Drake's_PC on Instagram. I'm Drake Mcgruder on Twitter and on Facebook. So please give me a follow if you haven't already. And if you've got any questions, look forward to seeing you on there. But thanks again.
Yeah. And thanks for being a great person in the hobby, whether it's sports cards, wrestling. Like, you've been awesome to deal with. And I love, like, when I'm listening to Lucas Tigers and Bronze, or listening to Card Talk or some other, and they're like, Drake's PC's got a question. I'm like, all right, this is going to be good. So thank you for just being a great representation of the hobby.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you guys for watching. See you. Thanks again to Drake for coming on the show today, giving us his quality time to help you, the viewers, and the Wrestling with Cards community. Drake's one of the best dudes in the hobby that I've ever met. He's really helping the visibility of wrestling cards and showing off the importance of wrestling cards to the mainstream, regardless of what anybody else that he knows in the sports card community feels about it. And putting his money where his mouth is and being a true collector at heart. Make sure to follow Drake on Instagram, link in the show notes to his profile, or you can just search at Drake's PC. And while you're there checking out the links, don't forget to check out all the ways you can help show your support to all the content I put out. Social media, Patreon, podcasts, it's all down there. So make sure you check that out. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope me and Drake were able to give you guys some information, some food for thought for you to take the way you collect and apply it. Until next time, click the videos on the screen for more great wrestling card content. We'll see ya.